Hello friends! With the Procreate 5.4 update, there are now even more incredible default brushes to choose from, and we're going to explore some of them. In this video, I'm going to try Yolla. To find this brush, make sure you're in the new Procreate library, go to the markers set, and Yolla is near the bottom of the list. As usual, I haven't made any changes in the brush studio, and I'll be using the brush exactly as it was installed. I also have my canvas set to 4000 by 3000 pixels at 300 dpi. Before we dive in, I'd love if you'd like, comment, subscribe, and watch till the very end because it really helps the channel. We're going to take a look at the brush behaviors. First, I'm going to see what the stroke looks like at a few different sizes. Now, it can get down to a really small size, but the color is so light at this size, and it makes it pretty hard to see. So I'm going to bump that up a bit. Okay, I've got it at 3% here, and it's a little easier to see what's going on. It's a smooth, clean line, and if you look closely, you can see areas where the stroke overlaps itself. So clearly it's pretty transparent. That transparency is much more obvious here at the medium size, and there's also a bit of value shifting happening in some areas. At the largest size, you can see subtle lines within the stroke, presumably to mimic the look of a felt tip nib, and the end of this stroke is very squared off, so it seems like it will also mimic the behavior of a chisel tip marker. With that square tip, I'm guessing it's not a tapered brush, but let's see if it's pressure sensitive. It looks like it responds to pressure just a little. The stroke size doesn't change, but the value shifts slightly and gets a little darker the more you press down. If I switch my grip and use the side of the pencil tip, the color gets really, really light and even more transparent, especially when you compare it to using a regular grip. All right, so we've already determined that the brush is transparent, but I'm still going to do the opacity test, put down a few swatches of color to see what happens. Of course, it's a low opacity brush and you can see right through the swatches. And I noticed that because of the transparency, the light colors really don't show up over the dark colors. They basically disappear when you try to layer them over dark colors. If you look really, really closely, you can see the pink has shifted the color of the orange ever so slightly. But layering light colors directly over dark colors is really not an option with this brush. Now let's switch to the smudge tool in the same brush to see how it blends. Not very effective. I mean, it certainly smudges, but not in a good way. If you'd like to use this same process for testing your brushes, I made a brush testing worksheet for you. There's a link in the description for the free download. Okay, time to really test this brush. I found a photo of some root vegetables, which I'm going to use as a reference. And since the brush size can get so small, I decided to start with a quick sketch outline for each veggie, just so I have the basic shapes and placement figured out. The fact that the color gets really light when this brush is set to a small size is actually helpful right now because I can keep these sketches really light and subtle. All right, I'm going to start layering my colors, starting with a couple bright colors, then building from there, just to keep the colors from feeling too flat. The trick with this brush is that, much like with real markers, you're going to see every stroke mark. So if you're used to working with flat, solid color, there's a bit of a learning curve. I still find myself scratching my head about how to approach marker drawings like this because they just work so differently compared to the brushes I typically use. One of the biggest things to get used to is how the color shifts. The more strokes you add, the darker the color gets. So you really have to keep that in mind when selecting colors. Otherwise, your finished palette could look much different than you intended. Like here, you can see how deep this maroon color has gotten compared to where it started. For the shadows, I want to use a little blue to add more richness to the darker values instead of just using more of the maroon. But when I add it on the same layer, it's getting lost and a bit muddy. So I'm going to add the blue to a new layer. Okay, that's what I was hoping for. I like that unexpected shock of color. I'll do the same over here as well. Then I can blend in more of the deep red, the maroon, to tone it down slightly. And I'm doing this on the same layer as the blue. I'm going to push it a little further with a really bright pink. I just really like the contrast that these pops of color create. I also want to add a highlight in a light pink, but if I add it to this current layer, the color will just get lost and blend into the hot pink. So I realize I'm going to have to put the highlight on its own layer. I'm taking a similar approach to the radish in terms of color building, just keeping in mind that this red will go really dark really quickly if I keep adding more strokes. Since the red got a little darker than I wanted it to, I created a new layer and added a more vibrant red to brighten things up a bit. Like we saw earlier, light or bright colors can show up over dark colors, but they need to be added on a different layer. The biggest challenge for me with this brush is getting used to this square chisel tip. Anytime I use traditional markers, I always opt for a brush tip, so I haven't had much practice using a chisel tip, and to be honest, I'm not quite sure how to approach this. Especially with the added complication of the overlapping strokes being so obvious. I mean, I almost had a meltdown with these carrots, I'm not gonna lie. You kind of have to be prepared to try and fail multiple times with this brush. I eventually figured it out. First, I put down a base layer of the yellows using straight lines with the brush at a fairly large size. Then I discovered that if I add the orange on a new layer above that, it looked less streaky and the overlapping lines weren't as obvious. Also, it was easier to draw shapes with the chisel tip when it was set to a slightly smaller size. From there, I made some areas darker by just adding more strokes of the same color. Added simple highlight lines in yellow on a new layer, and kept the details fairly minimal with a few horizontal lines. These aren't as subtle as I hoped for. When I made the brush size much smaller, the lines just kind of disappeared. And at this size, it's a little chunky, but it's fine. The process for the turnip was basically the same as what I did for the beets and radish. I just used different colors. The fact that the brush size can get very small came in handy again when adding these tiny offshoots on the roots. And the transparency helped these lines to look really fine and wispy compared to everything else. Based on how this brush works, I knew I wouldn't be able to approach the leaves like I normally would, so I took a really loose approach and just tried to embrace the fact that the stroke marks would be prominent. I added multiple layers of different greens and used loose lines and curves to basically just give suggestions for the shapes, volume, and details. Finally, I added a background color and a few light shadows. So overall, I think if you have experience with markers and you've got the right technique, this brush could probably create some pretty incredible results. Since I was just winging it, I found it to be a bit frustrating at times, but persistence paid off because I actually really liked the end result. Those visible stroke lines bring an expressive energy to the drawing, and with the transparency, you can get really interesting results when you layer colors. I could be wrong, but I'm going to guess that Yolla is meant to mimic the look of an alcohol marker, especially when I think of how it works compared to the marker brush from the classic library, which I reviewed about a year ago, because that one seemed more like a water-based marker. If you've tried the Yolla brush, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Let me know in the comments. If you'd like to see more from this brush review series, there's a link to the playlist in the description, and if you enjoyed this video, remember to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. Thanks for watching.